Aloha, everyone. My name is Tom Woods. I'm Executive Director of Hawaiian Mission Houses, Historic Site and Archives. And you are in the session B2, Creating a Great Heritage Site Experience. So if you're in the wrong room, now's a good time to move to the other one. But I think this is going to be a really fun program. It's about creating those messages and the programs for the visitor. And we have two people to speak with you today who have a lot of interesting things to say. First, you'll be hearing from Heather Diamond, who's a curator at Iolani Palace, current president of the Hawaii Museums Association, and a lecturer at the University of Hawaii. She earned a BFA in Studio Art and MA in English from University of Houston, and a PhD in American Studies and certification in International Cultural Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's the author of American Aloha, Cultural Tourism and Negotiation of Tradition. Heather will be speaking first, and then second, you'll be hearing from Burlingame. Burl was born in Alaska, Bush Territory, and raised on a former Imperial Japanese Navy Air Base in Taiwan. Author and historian, Burl has a keen sense of Pacific history. Currently the curator at Pacific Aviation Museum, Pearl Harbor, Burl is the author of I'll Fly to Hawaii, Battleship Arizona, Advance Force Pearl Harbor, Black Ocean, Dakine Sound, and other works. He majored in both journalism and anthropology at the University of Missouri and began to couple the discipline of scientific observation and the creativity of mass communications with the goal of popularizing historic interpretation. He has worked as chief photographer for the Sun Press newspapers, media advisor for Hawaii Pacific College, and editor of Hawaii Coastal Zone News, before joining the Honolulu Star Bulletin in 1979. As a reporter specializing in cultural, historic, and preservation issues, Burl has won several awards. So Heather is going to begin, and then please hold your questions until after both presentations have been completed, and you'll come to the microphone as before. If you don't want to go to the microphone, though, we actually do have a remote microphone now, and I don't want to discourage anyone from answering questions or asking questions, and sometimes they don't want to be on the spot like it's a public hearing or something where they have to come to the center aisle. So if you want to just stay seated, raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone over to you. So please give a hand now for both of our speakers, Heather and Burl.
Aloha. First, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to talk to you about what we're doing at the Palace. I'm going to be giving you some sneak previews of new things that are happening. And I'm also grateful I get to go first so I don't have to live up to the storyteller down here. But I have the Palace. So most of you are familiar with the Palace. We are a heritage site that doesn't take a whole lot of marketing to get people to our doorstep, but we're about to make some major changes in what we're doing. So I'm very happy that this is the first opportunity I've had to show some of this publicly. What we do right now is we show period rooms. From 1969 to 1978, the focus of the Palace has been on restoring the building, first of all, and then refurnishing the building. You probably know that the majority of the furnishings disappeared after the overthrow. Many of them that weren't taken away by former occupants were, some of them were given to Bishop Museum, some of them were given to the State Archives, and the rest was auctioned off at public auctions, a number of those. And so a lot of the focus in the refurnishing has been in reclaiming and repatriating those belongings that had once been in the Palace. And so that's been a very long process. In fact, it's continued up into this year. We have 2 rugs that are being woven right now that will probably be installed in the royal bedrooms by the end of this year. We've been in the midst of a 4-year, more like 7-year, including the research phase, textile refurnishing project. We've been reproducing the historic textiles in the royal bedrooms and on the grand hall floor, the upper hall floor, and the staircase based on the old black and white photographs and a lot of historical research. So if you haven't been there recently, I encourage you to come see what you're seeing right here. And that's something that has changed not only the look of the palace, but also the acoustics of the palace. No more echoing grand hall. The docents can actually hear each group instead of hearing all of them at once. So it's been quite a transformation that's happened. But we haven't really until recently addressed the changes in interpretation of the palace. Starting in 1978, when the palace was opened as a mostly empty space, the focus has been on guided tours. We started with a lot of volunteers that were trained to give a guided tour that lasted anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. They take people through the palace. You can see the famous booties in the photograph. We now have new booties. They're a little bit nicer than those. But we have been taking people through on a tour that goes through the period rooms that invites them to step back in time and recreates the environment of the 1880s. So first of all, people that went into the palace when it was empty were not only told to imagine that they were there during that time, but they were also asked to imagine the furnishings. Now there's not quite as much imagination that's happening, but there's still an experience of stepping back into a period that really celebrates the accomplishments of the monarchy, as well as introducing a lot of the very volatile politics of that period of time. And that's a tricky balance to achieve. Early on in the 70s, that was often presented to docents as something that they needed to imagine in terms of the docent, or in terms of the visitor group, that they were told to imagine they have somebody who's a sovereignty activist, somebody who's a missionary descendant, and a whole lot of people that don't know anything in between, and that they were supposed to try and please all of those people by presenting a mostly unconfrontational narrative, which is pretty hard to do given who we are and where we are and the kind of stakeholders we have and the community investment in our place. So what you see here is pictures of, first of all, a docent tour being given by someone who's been trained in royal history and trained in a particular narrative of the palace. They are allowed to create their own narrative within those parameters. And then you see a later development, which is audio tours starting in 2006. A lot of our docents disappeared. We didn't have enough. We have more and more visitors, around 115,000 a year now and going up. So audio tours filled that gap. And so we have an audio tour that started with an audio wand and is now a multimedia device that allows people to go through, not in a group where they have to stay with the docent the whole way and are told to keep up and can ask questions, but they're going through with an audio device that tries to fill in answers to all the questions anticipated, because there's not a person to answer those things. So people are self-guided on that to some extent, but they have stops that are in a particular order that follow the docent tour. And I've thrown in our touching harms artifact signs, because in both of those, not only are your feet not supposed to touch the floor, but your hands aren't supposed to touch anything along the way. This doesn't always work. I often find my touching harms artifact signs have moved around the tables in some very interesting ways. So again, our audio tours, we started with English, Hawaiian, and Japanese. And even though our Hawaiian tours don't get used that much, it's very important that we have those. And we have immersion schools that come in, charter schools that come in that use those tours. And we've recently added Chinese, Spanish, German, French, and we will have Korean this next month, I believe. It's a little overdue. And this is a picture of our antenna audio device. It's a multimedia device that not only has the audio tour, which has some dramatizations in it, multiple voices, it has historic documents being read, it has some music. It also has visual images. So people walk into a room and they see a picture of where they are, first of all, so it serves for wayfinding. It also has historic photos of those rooms so they can see what the room looked like during the 1880s and what it looks like now. And sometimes there are close-ups. So we have a we have 2 portrait galleries so that people can see the portraits of the kings up close and they can see the captions on those. We also have a portrait gallery that shows all of the portraits in the dining room. So it allows people to get up close to things they can't see up close, but they still can't touch them. 2000 and 2001, the basement galleries were added. These are one end of the former storage rooms and service rooms. This is really challenging because no photographs were taken of those areas. We only have photographs of later eras in these rooms, but we don't have historic photos from the 1880s of these particular spaces. We have the formal photographs of the blue room, the throne room, the dining room, but not these spaces as well. So we were working from a report called the Fairfax Report, which is an extensive and exhaustive study of the creation and restoration of the building. And these first galleries were created to be as unmuseum-like as possible because the people that were creating this really wanted to maintain the integrity of the building, and this was a time prior to a lot of the current visitor studies in museum studies as well as tourism. So we have signage, which we don't have upstairs. We have various objects that are displayed in cases so that they're much more accessible than they would be upstairs, where they might be on the walls or they might be far away from people that are looking. But they're still rather inaccessible. It's very formal, and it's still pretty much hands-off. I mean, people do put their hands on the cases and we wipe off the fingerprints, but other than that, this is very much a look and learn environment rather than something where people can engage with that. Not surprisingly, we often see families in there where the adults are reading the signs to a child and interpreting what they see there in order to make it more accessible. Our interpretation is probably about age 12 on up and not below that. And for a very long time, we never allowed children under 5 in the period rooms at all. They now can go in a stroller and under the supervision of an adult, but there's really nothing for them to do other than maybe swing the audio device by its lanyard, which happens. In 2011, we did the first ever comprehensive visitor survey, which is as comprehensive as you can get. We got about a 15% sample on this, and we found out a whole lot of things we already knew, which was great. We found out that the majority of our visitors are female, Caucasian, college educated, over 50, or around 50. They come from outside of Hawaii, from a lot of international destinations as well as continental destinations, and most of them didn't know much about Hawaii when they got there, if anything. What it also told us is who's not coming to the palace. A lot of people that are stakeholders in the palace don't come to the palace, so we don't get as many local residents as we would like. We don't get that many younger people. We don't get families with children, probably because we don't let the children in. Repeat visitors, people go there once and they say, well, I've seen it. They saw it 25 years ago, but they've seen it, and they haven't even seen the recent things, and we weren't getting very many Native Hawaiians, the major stakeholders in the palace. They care about the palace, but they weren't coming. This is very useful information for grants. It's also very useful information for us to find out what we're not doing in terms of fulfilling our mission. So the first thing we did, this was partially funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services and partly by the National Endowment for the Humanities, was hire a consultant to come in and create a new master interpretive plan. We had one from 1973. That's several years before we even had visitors, much less furniture. So although it was a good plan, it was way, way out of date. And so this master interpretive plan is a document then to guide everything that we do from here on out. And this is some of the stuff that she came up with, that we need to create more hands-on experiences. We need to provide open-ended, less time-restricted things. People said they wanted to wander around, they wanted to bond with their friends, they wanted to talk about what they were doing. Can't do that on a docent tour when you've got 45 minutes and they're being timed to go through. They wanted to be able to move at will. They wanted families to come in. We needed to diversify our experience for different kinds of learning styles because not all visitors are the same. We're getting mostly the people that are interested in history and don't mind being lectured to, but there's plenty of other people that would rather have a different kind of experience. So we started working with this plan on creating something very different. And again, here's some of the exhibit techniques that answer to those needs, creating more show and tell, more show than tell, nonlinear pathways, digital interactives for people that want to engage with what they're looking at, bringing in questions rather than answers at the beginning so that people actually can reach their own conclusions. Creating more comfort for people, and also creating spaces where people can reflect and talk about what they're learning. We teach a very interesting, a very complex, and a very disturbing history. We don't want people to just go away disturbed and have them shut down emotionally and go to the beach and have a pina colada. We want them to want to read a book. We want them to engage with it emotionally. We want them to want to learn more. So we started planning new exhibits. And again, this was funded by 2 federal agencies, this planning process. I've just received the final packet on our planning, and I'm going to give you a sneak preview of what we're working on as we move into the final design and implementation phases. We started out with these ideas, these particular, well, actually the first 3, cuisine in the palace, music in the palace, Hawaii and world politics, which actually started as Hawaii in the world, and Hawaii in America, which we pushed into Hawaii and world politics. And then we added royal legacy to that mix. And you can see a view down the hall here that shows the spaces we're dealing with. They don't even have lights. I have 72 pieces of stored furniture in there. We've got a lot to do just to get this architecturally ready for the new exhibits. But it will be the other end, it'll be the diamond head end of our hallway in the basement. That's the opposite from where the existing galleries are. Working with a team of scholars, some in everything from ethnomusicology to Hawaii history and Hawaii decorative arts, we came up with a big idea. And then we've also worked with the Hawaiian advisory team further on into this planning process. And this is the big idea we came up with. Iolani Palace functioned as the heart of the Kingdom of Hawaii and a crossroads for the Pacific region. It lives on as a dynamic symbol of Native Hawaiian creativity, resourcefulness, and hope for the future. Key in this big idea that's going to govern the exhibits is nobody wants a victim story. They want that story to be told, but they don't want to reside in that victim story. We want to create something that emphasizes the accomplishments, the resourcefulness, the ingenuity, the world standing of Hawaii and Hawaii's monarchs. So now I'm going to show you the sneak preview from the drawings from the design package. I can't promise all these will come to reality. We have to raise a lot of money for this. But these are the ideas that the EDX team came up with that's been working with our scholars and our advisory team and our staff. EDX is out of Seattle, and they've worked a lot with state parks and other historical sites. So they've come up with, first of all, that we need some serious wayfinding. We have visitors coming from 4 directions. Maybe more than that, but we've got 4 major gates. People walk in, and we still have people circling the palace saying, do you have tours? Who built this? What is this? When I started, there wasn't even a sign on the palace that said what it was. So since we're open till 11 at night, because we're state grounds, and people wander in there at all times, we need to at least announce what we are. I've had local visitors say, do you have tours? So we're clearly not getting our message across. So we need to, first of all, tell people where to go, that we're open, that we sell tickets, and in what building. We have pictures of Halikoa, the barracks, where we sell the tickets, but people can't figure out where that is. So one of the things they said is, we don't even have a clear walkway. People are walking in a road to get there, and they wanted to create a designated walkway that welcomes visitors. And a visitor center. This is a picture of the barracks, Halikoa, where we sell our tickets, where we have our main shop. Creating a sense of welcome, an orientation. We'd like to incorporate more of the historical district. We'd like to show people what Honolulu looked like back when the palace was the palace and it was still occupied by the monarchs. We'd like to get people to view our orientation film, which is 10 years out of date, an updated version of that, as part of their orientation to all of this. So this is a view of what that might look like. And of course, we're thrilled with this because there are people in it, and the people are actively engaged, and they're talking to each other, and they're involved, and they're looking at a three-dimensional map of what this whole space could be. Here's our hallway. You just remember the empty hallway. We want sound. We want interaction. We want learning stations. We don't want people wandering down the hallway saying, "Where's the exit?" which is what they do most of the time now. That means, first of all, we've got to put in wiring in the hallway, which means taking up the floor and putting it back down. But we also have to create, and we have an opportunity to create interactive stations, one of them on Hawaiian language, and how language was used at the time of the monarchy, how it's used now, and language as an access into understanding the history and the culture represented by the palace as a lens for understanding a very tumultuous era in Hawaii history. And you'll see there are many kinds of wayfinding in this too. We have signs outside the doorways, there are three-dimensional objects, and the three-dimensional objects are designed for differently abled people to access what we have. Right now, we don't have any way to do that as well. Family learning. We started this plan thinking we need to do something for kids, and we started thinking about children's learning areas. And we quickly evolved from children's learning areas into family learning. And this was through working with our consultant, Beverly Shepard, who's an expert on family and community learning, that children learn better when they're learning with their parents, and families learn better when they're learning together. And so we need to create intergenerational kinds of learning experiences that are layered, rather than putting the kids in one place and the adults in the other place, which makes one a play space and one a work space, or one a school space and one a play space. We need to integrate those things so that families can talk about these things together. Parents can learn while they're teaching their children, and vice versa. Often children are learning while they're teaching their parents, particularly when you have people that are not speaking English as a first language. Our signs in the basement, by the way, will be in Hawaiian first and English second. And we're not sure yet how we're going to incorporate all those other languages, but we're talking about possibly using phone apps. Not sure how we're going to do this, but we certainly want to make it as accessible as possible. This is a view of the kitchen. The kitchen right now is a reconstruction of what the historic preservation architect and team thought the kitchen might have looked like. We know it's in its original location. Here's the kitchen actually being interacted with. We can take the cupboard doors off. We can fill up the drawers. We can make this a space that people are invited to touch and invited to learn in, rather than chiding people for doing what they do anyway, which is opening cupboards. This is a view of one of the galleries, kind of a cutaway view showing what the EDX team imagines as diversified learning. You have learning kiosks, you have signage. They're actually going to incorporate some of the objects that we have that are slated for deaccessioning into the design of these galleries, some of those frames, for example, that you see there. So again, spaces where people of multiple ages, different kinds of social configurations can learn together. So that's what we have in mind. We will be working into our capital campaign fund very soon, but we have a lot of big plans for Iolani Palace that are going to, I hope, change the way that people learn about a history we've been teaching all along. It gives us a space to teach those histories, plural, in a much more nuanced, much more complex way, because we have a lot more stories to tell. Thank you.
I'm not showing you any slides. I want you to imagine things in the greatness of your mind's eye. It'll be much more dramatic. Before I get into the museum, I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of sacred ground. When Americans tend to think of sacred ground, they think of religious sites in places like Jerusalem and Mecca. But in pre-contact cultures like Hawaii and the American Indians, these were generally sites of great beauty or places where people could meet safely, and it took on a religious context. In America, however, our religion is democracy, And we tend to beatify areas where conflict took place, battlefields, signing the Declaration of Independence, places where people struggled to be independent and maintain democracy. And so battlefields in America generally are more venerated than elsewhere in the world. They are our sacred ground. When you're on these sacred grounds, you realize you're looking at things through the prism of the people that were at the event that occurred there. In 1993, I was part of the Onipa'a, the reenactment of the Hawaiian overthrow. I was put in charge of the Marine detachment of the military guys, and taking it seriously, I drilled our guys so they were halfway military. And we took up residence at what was the old Opera House at the time, which is now the post office downtown. And there was some discussion about why the troops took up residence there, directly across from the palace. I didn't know. But looking at it with a military point of view, once we moved in there, I realized King Street bends right there. It's the only site in the area where you can be on King Street and look down the entire length of King Street in two directions simultaneously. If you look at it with a military point of view, it made perfect sense. But it wasn't until I was trained to look in that point of view that everything fell into place. Now, there's no interpretation explaining that today, but that might be helpful when you're doing the reenactments and things like that. When I went away to college in 1973, I went to a strange and bizarre place called Missouri and did my architectural digs in a place called Cahokia Mounds, which is near St. Louis. And at the time, we operated out of some shacks, and we always wondered where a museum would go into place. And because the area was so site-rich, and it was an area of great religious meaning to the Native American peoples that lived there, that you could just put a blindfold on and put a shovel in your hand and start digging anywhere and find something. The area was so site-rich, they could not figure out where to put a museum. And years later, when I went back and a museum had been built, they built the museum over the sites and incorporated the architectural digs as part of the museum itself. If you're ever in the St. Louis area, I'd urge you to check it out. It's a great way of combining those two things. 110 years ago, man left Earth for the first time. And it fundamentally changed not just the way we travel, but the way we look at the Earth. It created a holistic view of the Earth. So aviation not only was a matter of technology, it was a matter of philosophy. And it changed Hawaii in very fundamental ways. In the mid-60s, the legislature recognized this and created a demand for a museum. An aviation museum. Naturally, it fell on Bishop Museum to do that. They tried to do it for a while. And then it passed on to a museum that we opened up at the airport, the Pacific Aerospace Museum, which also honored Hawaii's space achievements. It closed down the day after 9/11 because of security concerns. And another museum was in the works at Pearl Harbor, using the original buildings at Pearl Harbor. And so basically they grandfathered into there. And so the Pacific Aviation Museum was born in 2006. That's another reason I'm not showing slides. We're a young museum and we're still trying to find our way. We are using historic buildings that have not been kept up by the U.S. Navy. So that's always a challenge in itself. We have a hangar, for example, that's 88,000 square feet. And when it rains outside, it rains inside. That's always a challenge for people trying to keep their artifacts dry. In my case, some of my artifacts are extremely fragile and weigh 30,000 pounds. They're called airplanes. And airplanes are just air held together with rivets with some heavy engines on them. They are surprisingly fragile. Hawaii law was changed in the mid-90s to include aviation artifacts as a special case. So if you ever find an airplane in your backyard, let us know, and we'll handle it for you. Anyway, dealing on sacred ground like Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor is sacred ground for many reasons. The ancient Hawaiians called Moka Ume Ume, which is now Ford Island, a special place. You could go there and have a party. It was sort of the Las Vegas of ancient Hawaii. What happened there stayed there. And, but it wasn't really anything more than a landing site, and it was the place aviation was born in the islands. So us aviation enthusiasts, our proselytizers of aviation philosophy, tend to look at Ford Island as a special place anyway. It's sort of like, you know, the garage where Apple Computer was born for a lot of people. But on December 7th, 1941, that changed fairly dramatically. And it became one of the few places in the United States where people recognized the name of the battle. And even if they're not quite sure where Pearl Harbor is, they've heard the words Pearl Harbor. It is the only airfield in the United States that has seen battle. The scars of battle are still there. There are bullet holes in the buildings. There are scars on the runway. It is also an active duty naval base, and we are currently in a time of war. So security is always an issue. And just getting out to Ford Island can be a problem. As most aviation museums are either shrines to technology or they're memorials. However, that means they're not really museums. They're museums you should walk out with. We should teach you enough in a museum to be able to ask more questions. And so we've been struggling with big ideas and things like that. And recently the Park Service, Danny, had a problem with their ticketing, and it affected our visitor flow pretty dramatically. Now, the Chinese have a phrase that, may you live in interesting times, and it's either a blessing or a curse. Our slow ticket sales, and we get all our money through the front door. We get no corporate funding. We get no government funding. We get no funding from the airlines. We get no funding from the travel agencies. All our funding comes from people who really want to visit Pearl Harbor and see airplanes they can't see elsewhere. Well, because of the ticketing slowdown, we have been taking a good, hard look at our mission at the museum. And like I said, most aviation museums were basically shrines to technology. We are shifting from that to basically being a historic site. And so you're visiting someplace unique, not just a place that shows airplanes. Airplanes are going to be a big part of it. Ford Island is the cradle of aviation here in the islands. The runway there started construction in 1916, so we're coming up on the centennial of that. The first military airplanes in Pearl Harbor were in 1913, so we're already past the centennial of that. But aviation didn't start in the islands until New Year's Eve in 1910. So aviation is still in its centennial phase here in the islands, and we are trying to interpret that for people, not just military stuff, but civil and civilian aviation as well. And as the guy who's being tasked with developing a lot of this interpretation, I struggled with a couple weeks over the words here and there, and decided to go with there. And because when you're at a historic site, you're there. And when I started interpreting things to indicate the past history of the area, I'm using the phrase "you are there" instead of "you are here," because here is a static term, and there's no going forward from that, but there is always a destination. And most of our visitors are not from Hawaii. They are from all over the world, and they are going to a place that they see in their mind's eye as Pearl Harbor, in some ways sort of a magical destination, a place of mythology, and you're trying to get there. And so that concept of there-ness, I guess I'm the apostle of there-ness there, is the thing we're trying to get across. And I'm going to stop right there so we can open it up for questions.
Okay, who wants to start with questions?
Okay. come on.
Again, you don't have to stand up in the middle of the room. I will come to you.
Dan?
I have a question to the palace.
You do have to talk in a mic, though.
Oh, okay. I have a question addressed to the palace, and that is, I haven't been there in a while, and I should go. And I was just wondering what interpretation you have on the World War II phase of martial law, and since it was a principal building that was taken over by the military, and Major General Green became the headquarters for martial law right there. Is there, as that 75th anniversary approaches, what is the palace doing to tell the story of martial law, since it's kind of, we've had it at the Judiciary Museum for some time and they've done a really good job, but actually the circle of that descended on that building, and that building has a history that spanned 4 years of martial law, the longest in American history. So I was just wondering what are you doing for the 75th, and what is the current interpretation of martial law at the palace?
That's a really good question. I don't have a really good answer for. There is currently no interpretation of that, and that's part of what we're addressing with this expansion. We've been telling a story. We've pretty much erased all the history afterwards, both in the restoration and refurnishing and in our interpretation. So we've been telling a story from 1882 to 1893 with one room that tells 1895 thrown in, and that's it. That's all we've been telling. We don't talk about those later eras unless a docent is asked a question directly. So that's a really good question, and it's really came up in strategic planning with our board back. We are still in discussion about how much that will be told. That section on Hawaii and world politics should incorporate the subsequent histories, but because we have such a strong group of advisors as well, that really has to be debated with both teams of advisors, how much we tell, how we tell that. I think I can tell you where we'll tell it, but I don't know to what extent. And probably we will tell those kinds of stories as peripheral stories in special exhibits rather than in the permanent, other than briefly in our permanent exhibits. But it certainly is being discussed that those larger stories should be told, and we've taken away an awful lot of the history that people remember. So we have people coming to the palace all the time that remember the offices in the building. So I just wanted to say that on November 8th, the restored restoration films of the palace will be shown at HIF at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So if anybody wants to go here, see the palace to celestial music in the background, it will be there.
Just a comment about that. I think that's a wonderful question because it really brings up the whole struggle in historic site interpretation. Do you preserve a building in its condition and interpret change over time, or do you select a period of significance and restore the building to that period? Which does limit you in terms of interpreting other eras then.
Well, I have a question for Heather. How are you interpreting Steve McGarrett's corner office?
That came up too, and I don't have a good answer for that either. I can say that these things were hotly debated. That's about all I can say right now. We'll be going into the final design phase, which will probably hash out a lot of those content questions. But right now, I would say it's about a 50-50 whether we bring in popular culture or not. I'm on the yes side.
Good.
But I have no power.
We do try to bring in popular culture at the Aviation Museum. Our F-104, for example, is a very fast, sleek-looking airplane that helped set all sorts of records, and Chuck Yeager flew it. But our particular F-104 is the actual airplane used in the TV show I Dream of Jeannie. And that seems to cause more buzz than anything else in the signage.
Okay, as I bring the mic to you, please identify yourself too while you ask your question. Manley, this is for you.
Thank you. Hi, Manley Cano with Native Hawaiian Hospitality. My question is, again, back to Heather, is besides the palace itself, there's so many places on the grounds that are very rich in the history and that a lot of people don't know about it. Are you planning on having any kind of maybe tours around the palace, you know, that corner area where they have the old cemetery that was, you know, where all of the
mound.
the mound, yes,
Yes.
exactly, and that's, and then of course even below that area, which is also steeped in history. Are you planning on doing anything to inform? Not only, you know, you talked about how do you get the Hawaiian people out there. I mean, I know a lot of people who don't even know what that palace is about and the grounds of the palace that would be very interested.
We currently do have a grounds tour, but we don't do it very often. It used to be done more often, and you know we have particular challenges because the grounds aren't ours, nor is the building. They belong to the state. And the building is leased to the Friends of Iolani Palace, so we're always negotiating what can happen on the grounds, who we can remove from the grounds, various other things to do with the grounds. We have recently put some signs there. We have signs interpreting some sacred stones in front of the Kanaina building, the old state archives. We have a sign that interprets the pavilion. And that required, you know, an archaeologist to come out and a lot of other things. We had to get everything approved. But we are talking about that, yes. I should have said that our consultants and the design firm quickly expanded the gallery project in the basement to incorporate the whole ground. So not just wayfinding, but interpretation of all of the space and how important that was to bring all that in. So it could end up being a phone app that interprets the grounds.
Other questions? Yes, just a second. Please identify yourself.
My name is Annette Kohilauli, and I'm with the Hawaii Ecotourism Association. I have two questions, and I kind of have ideas for solutions to your problems. Does the palace ever do free tours for residents on Sundays?
We have a Kama'aina Sunday every month.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Because I haven't been there
We
forever.
just don't
I used
tell
to go
anybody.
there when they were restoring it, and I got little tours of the walls and stuff, but I haven't been in since it was
One of the
done. That
things
was a
I
long
love
time
about
ago.
getting an NEH grant is that they require you to have 20 hours a month of free access to anything that they sponsored. So we'll have to consider that too.
Yeah.
So good question.
And then I have an idea for Burl. I went out to the Pacific, what's it called, Pacific
Aviation
Museum on a public radio party type thing once, and it was so fascinating. And I thought, maybe you need to turn it into a party place or something to get local residents there. I mean, it wouldn't have to be all the time, but, you know, on special occasions.
When I started working there, one of the things that surprised me was how few local residents have been to Ford Island. Andy Bumatai, yeah, he's been everywhere. He only came out to Ford Island for the first time a couple of months ago. And he's not a kid. I mean, there are a lot of people simply
lot of
don't go
us
there
aren't.
because they're, you know, scared of the Navy, and they ought to be. But we have large buildings. Like I said, one of our hangars is 88,000 square feet. And these buildings are always available for events. Our other income flow is through events. And for example, we've had events there that had 1,600 people and 400 people, you know, setting up the event. That's a pretty large event, and the interior space is larger than the convention center without poles in the middle of the room. It's the largest freestanding space in the islands, but it does rain inside the building. But the
Hand out umbrellas.
yeah, you know, Hawaii, the thing about Hawaii that makes Hawaii unique is, in terms of heritage tourism, is that Hawaii is always in a state of flux. And, you know, our state bird is really the construction crane. Let that sink in. And the places that make Hawaii unique tend to disappear if they don't pay their way immediately. And these places still should have value, however. And in terms of, we don't need to sell these places to local people. They know they exist. However, when visitors come to Hawaii, they come in pursuit of a type of propaganda, you know. Nice sunsets, you know, dinner cruises, palm trees, Mai Tai drinks, you know, watching other people surf, not surfing yourself. But if we can make their experience here a richer and satisfying and give a sense of Hawaii as a unique place culturally as well as physically, they go home a lot happier. And they come back because they know Hawaii is not a one-shot destination.
Other questions?
I'm closer. I'll be the central mic. Oh, someone go ahead. You can be the closer. Aloha. My name's Kepa Amali. I just have a quick question. Curious if anyone, perhaps in the room, has worked with good service providers for a GPS web-enabled app. Hearing a little bit about what you're thinking of there. I'm actually working on the entire island of Lanai, and we have a major program going on, but we are very interested in learning some of the experiences, what to watch out for or not. So if by chance someone's interested, and if you guys have done that. And Burl, I actually have a question for you that I'm really interested in today with William Cole's article about the downed Japanese aircraft, December 7th, 1941. Have you had any interactions or involvement with that also? So the two questions, but I'm particularly interested in that one because of the whole Honouliuli region history as well. So first question, anyone GPS web-enabled app development? And second, about that.
Well, my answers to both your questions are yes.
Groovy. So where do we go?
Because of Ford Island really only became open to visitors because of the Valor in the Pacific National Historic Site. Is that the name, Danny? I screwed it up, didn't I? We need a really good name for the site.
World War II Valor of the Pacific National Monument.
Yeah, it needs just to be called Cool Place. However, because it is at an active duty Navy site, and the Park Service people know that the Arizona Memorial was operated for 20, 25 years, something like that, without enabling legislation, which is what Congress does to establish the historiography of a particular site. The Navy was, I mean, the Park Service is basically doing the Navy scut work for it. However, the Valor in the Pacific designation helped the NPS, you know, take more command of what they were doing. However, Ford Island, in terms of being open to visitors, it is an active Navy site and it is an active housing site for military personnel. However, parts of it were doled out piecemeal into the park. And so you can go some places and not other places, and even though you're allowed in some places, sometimes you're not allowed to get to the place you're allowed to be at. I'm thinking of the Utah Memorial. It would help if the entire island was a National Historic Site. I keep having to tell our development people that we're not in national landmark buildings, we're National Historic Site buildings, but the landmark status would help. That might actually free up some federal money to keep the roof from leaking. But in order to find these sites on Ford Island with a degree of exactitude, GPS has helped. And we were able to give people exact GPS coordinates so they can go there. It's like wayfinding. Yelp also is an online company that is developing technology where you can hold up your iPad at a historic site, and it's like you're looking through your iPad, but you're getting signage on the screen and little videos and things like that. It's like you're looking through a window that's like a heads-up display, and that is technology that's coming along. In terms of the Japanese airplane out near Eva, that's pretty iffy at this point. There are a couple people pursuing that. Hawaii, however, is the third largest site for crash sites in the United States for aircraft. Something like 9,800 aircraft crashes have occurred here. 99% of them occurred during World War II training. The other two states are California and Florida. It's all training stuff, not war stuff mostly. But there is aircraft wreckage everywhere, and particularly out in the water. and hardly any of it has been mapped. But if you take a hike on Iolani Loop Trail, you'll see at least 3 crash sites just on that trail. Anyway.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question and answer. We've got about 3 minutes. Did you have another?
Chris Colvin, Hawaii Forest and Trail, and my question to both of you, follow up to kind of Annette's question, is if each one of you could just maybe take a minute and talk about how each one of your organizations has kind of grappled with this idea or notion that history and heritage and culture are maybe not fun things to do on vacation, just kind of for the benefit of us kind of looking to develop our own heritage tourism products.
And truly 1 minute apiece.
I think Tom should be answering this because it's fun at mission houses, and they've managed to make that transcendence. We're working on that. I think with our interactive technology, that's a big part of what we're doing in rethinking our interpretation. Again, I said we don't really want people to go away just shutting down emotionally and disturbed. We want them to be a little disturbed, but we want them to also enjoy themselves and to want to learn more. And so we need to find multiple points of engagement in what we're doing by finding multiple stories and multiple ways to tell those at different learning levels, different age levels, and ways of interacting. So I think that's the goal in all of this is edutainment. I say that not lightly because, of course, we have a very serious story to tell as well.
Well, some of us do think history is fun. However, edutainment is a good way of putting it, and people retain more when they're asked to even put their hands on instead of being lectured at. And if you make it fun, you make it stick. And when you're doing interpretation, you want to create what you call the big idea or the carry-away message, and all your interpretation should support that. And it's always a trick with non-museum people to tell them that the artifacts tell the story. You don't use the story to show off the artifacts. And so, Tom, can you summarize up for us and close this out?
I don't think we're there yet. We're working on it at Hawaiian Mission Houses. We're really doing a lot of special events that try to make history fun. We're using a lot of museum theater. Cemetery Pupu Theater has become one of our signature events where we actually go into a cemetery and we do research and create scripts for 5 people and then have actors perform those characters. People love it, and it's dinner theater in a cemetery. We also are doing summer theater. We have an outdoor theater at mission houses now. We have a series of 4 music programs that this year trace the transition of music over 5 different periods in Hawaii. What made Hawaiian music change at a particular point in time? What were the influences? And then we actually have performances afterwards about that. Next year we're going to do Mele Wahipana, so music of place, and talk about what is significant about a particular place and how has that been communicated in music and dance. And then have people talk to each other about it. It's all about engaging people in dialogue. I think that's something that we don't do enough of in maybe Waikiki, where you just see the dance and you hear the music, but nobody gets to talk about it. There's no dialogue. And I think that's what's really important, is engaging the audience in that dialogue. So we're also, for daily tours, we're doing a lot of reinterpretation too, but that's too long a story. So thank you all for coming. And the next, I guess, lunch is at 11:45.